will start sharing my screen. I hope everyone can see my screen. Great. So just to, before we get started, I also just want to quickly introduce Upaya Social Ventures, the organization that I currently work with. Upaya is an early stage investor. We primarily invest in for-profit businesses. We invest in very early stage companies. Primarily, we are usually the first institutional opportunities for the poorest of poor. So that's a quick introduction to Upaya Social Ventures. And Chitranjali has already done an introduction of me, so I'm not getting into that detail. But what I want to maybe quickly do is an introduction to the session. The session that I was asked to present was around what it takes for an initiative to be funding ready. And one of the questions that I asked the GAP team was, who are these initiatives? So the answer that was given was they're both for-profit and non-profit. So I've looked at both from a non-profit angle and a for-profit. And when I talk about funding, I'm talking about funding from either an investor or in the non-profit case from a donor or a foundation. And before I get into what makes or what you need to be looking at to be funding ready, I want to talk about what are the funding options available for both the sort of set of enterprises that are there. So for-profit companies, most for-profit companies start off by bootstrapping, which is similar to non-profit, which is when you have an idea, you want to start something, you either, get money from friends and family or your own money is what you put in and start. Then there's sort of crowdfunding, which is again available for both for-profit and non-profit, where you can reach out to a larger audience who might be interested in funding, your early stage organization. The next step is where, it sort of diverges, wherein for for-profit companies, it's primarily what we call angel investments. These are very early stage investments, usually done in for-profit ventures, when you're usually at a prototype stage where you're still testing out your product or service. In the for-profit sector, the next segment would be sort of what we call venture capital, where somebody comes in, either a venture capital firm or a high net worth individual comes in and puts in and actually takes a stake in your organization. The other sort of options available out there, now there are a number of incubators and accelerator programs that provide both capacity building support and funding opportunities. There are a number of competitions and challenges both in India and globally that early stage organizations can access to. And the last option that's for slightly more mature, once you have sort of a revenue model in place, maybe some assets in place, is debt funding. So those are the funding options available for for-profit businesses, whereas for not-profit or NGOs, again, crowdfunding I've talked about, but it's primarily driven by grants. So the options that you have is CSR funding, either from corporates or large MNCs. There are a number of foundations and family offices, both in India and globally, that support NGOs. And what a lot of new NGOs have been doing successfully is conducting fundraising events. It could be local fundraising events to sort of larger scale fundraising events. So these are sort of funding options available for both for-profit and non-profit organizations. So now moving into sort of what you need to do before you're funding ready. For me, as an investor, one of the key things that I look at is where you are in sort of this cycle that's being presented to you. When you have an idea, it's usually phase one. When you have an idea, to either start a for-profit or a non-profit, you're saying there is a problem or a need that needs to be addressed. The need or the problem can be addressed by a certain solution. So that's your hypothesis. That solution is your organization. Phase two is when you go test out the problem. You know, can you solve the problem? So let's say if it's education, higher quality teacher training, for example, that's, your solution. You need to go test it out. You need to first test the problem in the sense, do people who face the problem see that as a problem? And then phase three is when you test the solution. And then once you test the problem and the solution, you usually get feedback from customers or the end beneficiary, which is where you verify your hypothesis. In a number of cases, it's usually there that you might need to pivot. What I mean by pivot is actually change your model or your hypothesis. So as investors, they look at on which stage you are in the cycle, and how deeply you have done each of these phases. So this is a very, very critical part of being funding ready. The next slide is around sort of the business model canvas. The reason that I have this here is this is something both investors, foundations, donors very clearly look at these days. The business model sort of goes from from the right to the left, which is why I've numbered it accordingly. The first sort of block is the customer segment. So whether you're a for-profit or a non-profit, your customer, your end beneficiary, is the key. And everything around your business or your intervention revolves around that. From the customer segment, you need to look at value proposition. So let's say, what is that about your product or service or your intervention that makes it valuable or attractive or useful for your customer segment? So that's the second block that you really need to think through. The third is, what is the channel that you deliver your product or service? For example, if it's polio vaccination, is it through on-ground staff who go home to deliver polio vaccination in case of an NGO, for example? Or let's say you provide clean water as a business, as a social enterprise. How do you sell clean water to your customer segment? That's your channel. And the fourth being customer relationship. How do you build relationship with your customers so that they come back to you? In case of beneficiaries, how do you build that relationship with the end beneficiary that you can continue working with them? And all these, when you think about, has cost involved, and that creates your revenue. So that's the fifth block. That end of the day, you get, if you're a for-profit model, the income, that's your revenue. Whereas in a non-profit case, that's your impact. What is the impact that you create? So that's how you look at sort of the business model canvas on this side. And then moving on to actually carry out what's, 1 to 5, the key things that you would need. The first would be key resources. Again, how big is your team? What are the main resources that you would need in terms of, say, manpower? It could be financial requirement. It could be infrastructural requirement. Those are key resources. What are the key activities involved to carry out, what you've planned out in 1 to 5? And who would be potential partners that you would need to reach out to or build partnerships to actually deliver, that value proposition that you've identified in number 2. And all these activities will involve a cost. That's a simple truth. What are those cost structures? Manpower costs, for example, raw material costs could be one. Now, the reason that I'm showing this slide is this is what any investor, as I said, or donor would look at from your organization point of view. How deeply have you thought about each of these blocks? How clear are you when it comes to presenting these 9 blocks to any donor or investor? So that's known as a business model canvas. It's a free tool that's available online. You can access it. Just Google business model canvas and you should be able to get it. Moving on. So then, what does it take to be, investment ready? What do you need to actually go out to investors and donors? So what I've spoken so far is, one, what are the different funding categories available, the cycle in terms of where, in your product or your company cycle, where you are. Taking that approach helps you, build a strong case for any investor donor. And the third is the business model canvas. That's a tool that's very, very useful that you can use to make sure you've thought through, each of those blocks, so that when you approach a donor or investor, you're very clear about what you're doing and why you're doing it. In this slide, what I want to present is primarily two, the things that you will really need. These are more from a documentation point of view. When you meet an investor, if you need to send something across, or in a donor's case, if there's a call for proposal, what you really need, ready to access funding end of the day. For-profit, the key is market research. So it involves that entire cycle that we went through earlier, where you clearly identify who your target market is, what's your market size, and what's the need for your product and service. So actually getting down into detail on the ground, getting that information makes a very strong case. The next is a completed business plan. A completed business plan for me is just those 9 blocks. If you can clearly articulate and talk about each of those blocks, that's your business plan. And the next being obviously the financial model, which is from a for-profit point of view, is, if you're already generating revenues, what's been sort of your traction over the last 1 year, 2 years, and how do you see your business growing? Usually over the next 3 to 5 years is what investors look at. A financial model usually consists of an income statement, balance sheet, cash flow statement, and what your funding needs are. So that's quite straightforward. What a lot of early stage companies miss out is on exit strategy. So this is again something that I want to emphasize as an investor. Because we are investors, we need exit. That's the simple truth of it. Be it an impact investor, be it somebody who's looking at it, investing in the social enterprise sector. If it's investment, there needs to be an exit. You can take, each of our example as well, right? We all do some kind of savings, which is investing. And if somebody came and told you that you couldn't get your money back, you wouldn't invest in that instrument. So you need to think about what is the exit strategy for an investor. Impact investors usually look at 5 to 7 years. They look at maybe about 10 to 15 to 20% return, depending on the investor. Venture capital funds usually look at higher scale return. So depending on who your investor is, you need to come up with an exit strategy. So these, for me, are the 4 key things that you need to get ready before you can, actually approach any investor. On the nonprofit side, it's kind of similar. For me, the key has been always what I call a concept note, which is usually just 2 to 3 pages long, where you talk about what your intervention is, how do you plan to operate, who your end beneficiaries are, and why they require that intervention. That's what I look in, when I get concept notes in my earlier job, where we used to do a lot of grant funding. The next is what is called theory of change or logic model, which is primarily to explain to a donor, if somebody is giving you money, how you're going to impact a beneficiary's life. To clearly think through what is the impact. That's theory of change. Again, theory of change models are available online. Again, just if you Google it, you should be able to find it. The next being financial budget. What's realistically a good budget? What percentage of overheads goes to, say, manpower cost versus actually reaching the end beneficiary? Thinking through that while creating a financial budget. And the last point is, including 2 or 3 impact stories. That's what donors are looking for. That's, the key for donors. can you actually get, verified stories from one or two with a picture talking about, how your organization has been able to impact, the end beneficiary. So that's sort of what we, look at from a for-profit point of view and from a non-profit point of view. So that's sort of covers what I had in, to discuss or present to you all about, what you need to think through before you're ready to look for funding. Now, I think I can open it up for questions.